So I'm Olivia Hansen, and it is my pleasure to introduce Dean Radin, who is with us via Zoom on the screen. And Dean is chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Science, also known as IONS. IONS is doing amazing scientific research in the field of consciousness and spirituality, and also the interconnectedness of the world. Dean has a wonderful book, a new book on Supernormal, which you can see there, and it is available for sale in our bookstore. So Dean will be exploring expanded awarenesses in human beings and also phenomena. And they have done this research using the highest scientific rigor to prove that these things really exist, because material scientists and much of the outer world says that's not true, and Dean's research can prove this. Dean also quotes from sages of the ageless wisdom that say that phenomenon by itself does not indicate true high spirituality, but high spiritual virtues do, and those are the things that we're all working on to develop today and expand. So we have a real treat in store for us, and please join me in welcoming Dean Radin.
Thank you, Olivia. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, so I'm going to switch over to this presentation screen. My talk is entitled, Was Buddha Just a Nice Guy? I have 3 different versions of this talk. This is a short one, so will give us more time for questions afterwards. The long version takes about an hour. I figured that would be a little bit too long. So you'll get the gist of what's going on here, including why I asked that question. So when we think about our great spiritual masters, especially from ancient times, this is a picture or a drawing of Buddha levitating over disciples and ensconced in flame. So this is the kind of stories that come down to us from these great masters. Here's Charlton Heston parting the Red Sea. Here's Jesus walking on water. From a Western scientific perspective, when most academics look at these things, including, by the way, religious scholars of religion, they view these kinds of stories as mythology and a superstition, and certainly not as literal, which is interesting. And so it's not surprising that a lot of people in a secular sense see things like parting of the Red Sea as a fluke, just happened one day. Or in thinking about the 10 Commandments, I'm glad my name's not thou. And in this case, of course, it's somewhere between Jesus and Mother Mary and the Mona Lisa. But the miracle is that, of course, it appeared miraculously in a grilled cheese sandwich. This particular grilled cheese sandwich was sold by the woman who found this thing, or made it, to a casino in Las Vegas, where you can still see it today. And the miracle involved in it is that it was supposedly incorruptible. In other words, it's not decaying over time. We don't know whether it had been preserved with something or not, but that's part of the lore. And by the way, if you want to see lots and lots of pictures of things like this, you go to a website called thingsthatlookLikeJesus.com. If there is no God, then how come the world fits so perfectly into a chicken? So these are all used in a way to say that we're modern and sophisticated, we We put science at the top of what we take to be true. And so stories about God and spirituality and the special powers of the saints are superstition. And it couldn't possibly be anything more. And that brings us to the question, was Buddha just a nice guy? And the reason I ask that is because the Dalai Lama, as many of you know, for many years has been holding meetings between scientists and the Tibetan Buddhist monks to discuss similarities and differences. And the scientists talk about the brain and neuroscience and so on. And it's all very interesting. But then occasionally the Dalai Lama says, well, what about reincarnation? And what about the oracle that we use as part of Tibetan practice to predict what the future is going to be? And the scientists all back away and they say, no, we don't know anything about that. It's probably not real. And almost every meeting, the Dalai Lama or one of the other monks will ask, well, what about? I mean, we're talking about the aspects of Buddhism that fit with science, but what about the parts that don't? So unfortunately, the scientists that speak with the Dalai Lama are very mainstream, and they actually don't know what the literature is. So the underlying question here is, do these supernormal abilities actually exist? And are they divine gifts, or are they latent human potentials? So we ask a question like, was Buddha just a nice guy? From a neuroscience perspective, the answer is, well, probably, but that's all. It can't be anything else. And so that's why we're asking these questions. Is it actually true? Is the neuroscience perspective true, or are they missing something? They, by the way, is me included, because I do neuroscience as well. So when we look at not Buddha as the title, but the man, Siddhartha, maybe he was the George Clooney of the day. He had a good tan, he had a good smile, he knew how to work a crowd, had a certain charisma, and maybe that was sufficient to take his teachings to last several thousand years. I would be surprised if many people knew who George Clooney was in several thousand years. So it does raise this question on, is it simply celebrity or is it something else? And something else I'll illustrate using that because I don't know what else to use. So the path to answering this question about the Buddha, I decided to take the yogic path, partially because it's a way of talking about an ancient practice that is now completely mainstream in some respects. And so we know that something has become part of the mainstream when it appears on the cover of Time magazine, because Time magazine is, in a sense, a reflection of whatever popular culture is. So these are already 15, 16 years old already, that yoga and meditation have become part of mainstream culture in the West, not just the US, but other Western type countries. And from all that, we can say, well, what's the purpose of yoga? What are people trying to do with yoga and meditation? We go back to the original classic book, Meditation, which was written by this Indian sage named Patanjali, roughly 2,000 years ago. And it's thought that the Yoga Sutras were actually the first written form of a very ancient oral tradition at that point. So this is a written form of an oral tradition. At the time, there wasn't much paper around, so books tended to be very short. These are 4 little books made out of 196 paragraphs. A sutra is is the idea of a thread or an aphorism, but it's basically little paragraphs written in Sanskrit. The upshot of the Yoga Sutras is all about samadhi. So samadhi is a Sanskrit term which roughly means what we might say is a mystical union state, a state of union with the universe. And the 3rd book of the Yoga Sutras is all about the Siddhis, which is a Sanskrit term meaning perfection or attainment as a result of disciplined meditative practice. So first, when you can achieve samadhi or mystical union at will and sustain it for however long you wish, then you are prepared to learn how to do the Siddhis. So this is not something that would spontaneously appear for the average person unless they happen to have natural talent. But it is said within the yogic tradition that anybody can learn at least some of the siddhis, provided that they practice long enough. The third book is called Vibhuti Pada. Vibhuti is a kind of ash that happens when you burn wood. And the metaphor here is that you burn through your ego, and you burn through the various limitations that you have, and you achieve then an entirely different state, a state where you can produce the siddhis. So the technique, as described by Patanjali, is called samyama, and it consists first of learning how to do elementary meditation called dharana, and then a longer-term meditation, dhyana, leading eventually to samadhi, which is complete absorption or mystical union. And then once you have achieved the samadhi, you keep in mind a small degree of attention on something. And it can be literally anything that you keep in mind. And because you're in a state of mystical union, you become the object of attention. So as an example, if you focus as the object of your attention on a friend, in some respects, you become the friend. And in that state, mentally, you know everything there is to know about the friend. So we would call this, in today's language, something like telepathy. But it's more than telepathy. It's more like you become that person. Well, that's what it says in the Yoga Sutras. The Yoga Sutra says lots of other things about the various siddhis, and I regard these as kind of superpowers. And they fall into three different categories. There are 26 that are mentioned. Within the category of mind-body interactions, we have things like super healing of yourself. So you can drink poison and actually resolve it within yourself so it doesn't act like poison. Then we have inedia, where you don't need to eat or drink anything. You live off of spiritual or cosmic energy. Super strength, super speed, levitation, and then the opposite of levitation, where you become extremely heavy. So these are all considered pretty much straightforward siddhis that people can develop as a result of meditative practice. Most of the siddhis are variants of clairvoyance, seeing with the mind's eye through space and time, from the most microscopic to the most macroscopic. And then some of the siddhis are psychokinesis, or mind over matter effects. The typical case there is you feel one day that you'd like to have a diamond, and you mentally manifest it, and now you have a diamond. That's different than something like levitation, because levitation of your own body is a mind-body interaction. It involves some kind of mental force, perhaps, but levitating somebody else would be considered a psychokinetic effect, because it's acting at a distance. So that's what the 26 siddhis are described. Virtually all of those would, from a modern scientific, or at least an orthodox scientific perspective, would be at best interesting stories, because they do sound very much like the kinds of things we hear about superhero comics. So the question underneath this all is, well, is this particular to yoga or not? And of course the answer is no. Every culture has described various forms of siddhis. So they call them different things. In Catholicism, we call them charisms. In Islam, they're karamats. They have names in Judaism, Tibetan Buddhism, all shamanic traditions, all esoteric traditions have names for these things. In some traditions, there are maybe a dozen. In yogic, there are 26. In Catholicism, there are a couple of hundred. But when you start pushing them all together and get a taxonomy of it, they fall into the three categories that I mentioned: mind, body, clairvoyance, and various forms of mind-matter interaction. So how do we test if these things are real or not? If you look in the third book of the Yoga Sutras, Sutras 19 and 20 are called knowledge of minds. This is what we would call telepathy. So in the sutras, the way you do it is, as I said before, you focus on a friend, or you focus on somebody else in the state of samadhi, you become them, and you have complete knowledge of their mind. So in the laboratory, what we do is, it's very difficult to find people who have actually developed the siddhis in modern day. They are among us, people with very long-term meditative practice, and specifically trying to learn how to do the siddhis. But there's a prohibition within the yogic lore, which says that part of the yogic path is the very first part is learning how to get your ego out of the way. And the yogis learned very long ago that once you develop some of these powers, that they're extremely seductive, and you can gain power over other people very quickly. And if you do that, you become Darth Vader. The yogis recognize the dangers involved in developing these special abilities. And so there's a prohibition that's even written in the Yoga Sutras that you shall not present them. You don't demonstrate these things. That makes it difficult from a scientific perspective because the very people who would like to study know that we're looking for them and they just step out of the way. They don't want to be studied. So instead, we deal with people who what might be thought of as naturally having some of the siddhis just by virtue of a happy birth. So here's an example of how we do this in the laboratory. The woman who's having she's having half of a ping pong ball put over each eye by my assistant, Lena. And the lady's name is Gail, who's sitting in the chair, and she's somebody who's a natural psychic who almost every day will have something like a telepathic rapport with someone or precognition or something like that. She just part of her life because she's a natural. So this is part of an experimental design that's been going on for a long time. The reason we're putting the ping pong balls over her eyes is that we want to ask her to keep her eyes open, and then we shine a red light on her face. We'll also put on her ears, we'll put headphones that play white noise. And the point of all that is to create a sense of a dreamlike state where because her eyes are open, she won't fall asleep, but she can't see anything, she can't hear anything, she's in a comfortable chair. And within about 10 minutes, if you're in that state, you begin to produce hypnagogic imagery. And the reason is because your mind and your brain get tired of seeing nothing, so you'll begin to dream. And you become extremely sensitive to any kind of external input. And in this case, the external input is from a friend of hers who's located elsewhere in the building, who is going to try to mentally send her a picture. So Gail's put into this case called, this condition called the Ganzfeld, which is a German word that means whole field. It's a way of describing a form of sensory stimulation that's completely uniform. It's completely unpatterned to induce this dreamlike state. So Gail's resting in that condition. Meanwhile, we had prepared in advance 4 pictures that are as different from each other as we can manage. One of these 4 pictures is randomly selected by a throw of a die. The picture is then shown to a man named Ray, who's Gail's friend. Ray's on a second floor of a building in a different room and completely isolated from Gail. And so one of these 4 pictures is given to Ray to send to Gail mentally. By chance, later Gail's going to have to guess which one of the 4 was sent. And so you can see, obviously, there's a 1 in 4 chance that she would select it if telepathy didn't exist. So Ray makes a random decision. He threw the die said choose one of these 4 images. So one of these 4 images he's mentally sending to Gail. And this is what Gail says. Now remember, she's isolated. She can't hear or see anything, but these are the impressions that are coming to her mind. Something has a rough texture, tall, looking up high, like in an art gallery or in a museum. A Yosemite kind of image of a tall rock, monolithic, images of Mount Rushmore, half dome, like a big stone. So at this point, this was compressed about 20 minutes of actual words that she had said. Most of the time she's sitting there for a minute and doesn't say anything, and then she'll say a sentence like this. And this is literally exactly what she said, just little snatches of impressions. So after 20 minutes, we tell Ray to stop doing the mental sending. We take Gail out of this Ganzfeld condition, and then we show her 4 pictures, one of which is the one that Ray was sending, and then 3 are decoys. And as you can see, we chose them to be different from each other to avoid the problem that impressions can be matched against different kinds of images. So Gail's task at this point was, given what she said and what she experienced, what did she think that Ray was trying to send? And in this case, you can probably guess that Ray had randomly selected this picture. Obviously, Ray and Gail beforehand had no idea of any of the pictures we were going to use, and Gail was correct that that was the picture that was sent. So this is, and consider this like throwing a dart at a dartboard. You can either hit it or you can't. In this case, Gail had a hit. So the chance was 1 in 4, and this is not going to convince anybody of anything except maybe Gail. So as we often do in scientific experiments, we have to repeat this many, many times and many, many people to see whether or not this hit was chance or maybe something beyond chance. So these are the kinds of alternative explanations that we look at. We make sure through the design of the experiment and the execution of the experiment that there wasn't any kind of leakage that was happening between Ray and Gail. Obviously, if they had any way of communicating, then the game is over. We also make sure that when we record the results that we were correct, that when the process of randomly choosing a picture, that it's really random. We know that there are variations in how experiments are conducted. So we pay attention to critiques over the years and make it as high quality as we can. We also know that there's a tendency for researchers to report experiments that work and to ignore the ones that don't work, and this is called selective reporting. And it creates a bias, which is called the file drawer effect. And this is that if you're able to somehow get into every researcher who had ever done this kind of experiment and look into their file drawers, you can compare what is known to be out there through publications versus what is hiding in their file drawer where they didn't get a good result and they decided not to publish it. There are also editorial biases. A lot of journals don't like the published studies that didn't get a good result. Well, all of these questions and many more have been known in parapsychology for many years, and as a result, all of the journals that publish these kinds of experiments have an explicit policy that it doesn't matter if the experiment was successful or not, we still need you to publish it. And that's to get rid of this problem of the file drawer effect. So all of these, this long due diligence list we go through in the design and the execution of the experiments, the bottom line always is, there are actually two bottom lines. One is, could it be fraud? And so the experiments are designed in such a way that both the subjects, the sender and receiver, cannot produce fraud, and the experimenters can't produce fraud either. So these are all built into the design. The bottom line in every area of science is, can an independent person replicate this kind of study? The reason why this is important is because we always do our best in designing an experiment, but maybe we forgot something, or maybe somebody in the laboratory was doing some funny business that we couldn't detect. So we rely on independent replication to be able to say that this is true from a consensus perspective, that other people see this as well. So we look at all of the experiments known of this type. This is from about the 1970s through 2010. There were 122 experiments that were retrieved, both published and unpublished, reported by 20 different laboratories around the world, and 4,674 sessions, similar to the one that I just described with Gail and Ray. So when you look across the board, you can see the line there labeled chance, that's 25% hit rate, and each little dot is the actual hit rate in a given experiment of each 122 experiments. Just using your eyeball, you can tell that the average is above 25%. So those were successful experiments. There were some that did not work. You can tell that not only the dots are below chance, but the error bars actually exclude chance. So these experiments don't work every single time. But the question is, well, what happens when you look at this roughly 40 years worth of experiments that are all doing the same thing again and again and again by different investigators? To make it easier to answer that question, we can look at this hit rate in a cumulative form, where we simply add up the trials over many experiments. And that gives you this. And what you see here is, first of all, that it's far away from chance. The average overall effect is Here it's about 32%, and chance is down there 25%. This has been repeatedly published in one of the top academic psychology journals called Psychological Bulletin. Discussed both presenting the evidence, debates about the evidence, and the reason it's reported repeatedly is because as the experiments continue, there's more and more that we can add on to this meta-analysis. The odds against chance of being at 32% instead of 25% is 300 trillion quadrillion to 1. Usually in psychology, at least in the social sciences, that odds against chance of 20 to 1 is considered to be statistically significant. In some areas, like in physics, you may need much more than that, more like 10,000 to 1 or 100,000 to 1 in order to be considered a definitive result. So here we have 300 trillion quadrillion to 1. The magnitude of the effect is not big. This is 32%, so we're only 7% better than you would expect by chance. But because there's so much data, this has been repeated so many times now that we know that people who are not selected for having the siddhis, having no claims of the siddhis, no claims even of psychic ability, these are mostly college sophomores, as psychologists like to use college sophomores, because basically they'll do anything for credit. And that's important in this case, because what it means is we're dealing with a general human ability, whether people know that they have the ability or not. And that tells us that this is, as the yogis have said, this is an inherent capacity. It's part of human potential. Some people will get exceptionally good at this, either through meditative practice, or some people are simply born that way. Like Gail simply has this ability. She didn't work on it, she just has it. But it is possible to develop it as well. On the flip side, of course, is some people cannot develop it, because just like some people cannot sing to save their life, the same is true here, that people have different talents, and some are good at this and some are not so good. But we know now that from these kinds of experiments that at least telepathy is an ability that's widespread throughout the population, at least to a little bit. So what about this issue of replications? Well, not only do we see that there are a lot of people who have replicated, but what about skeptics? These are people who explicitly say in their write-up of the study, they don't believe in any kind of psychic anything. Well, up until 2005, no skeptics did these experiments. So we had no way of answering the question, could a skeptic do it? But in 2005, two professors actually did publish studies using the same Gansfeld method, which I just described. And they write, after 8 studies, we had an overall statistically significant hit rate of 32%. This is exactly what we've seen over 40 years with lots and lots of replications. So this means that skeptics, if doing the procedure correctly, actually do get the same results that everyone else has. So that question can be answered. Unfortunately, what this also demonstrates is that if you're coming at these kinds of phenomena from the point of view that they cannot exist, that they're impossible for one or another reason that you make up, then even if you get a significant result, as we see in this experiment, they still won't believe it. And so they write in this paper that this result was precariously close to demonstrating humans do have psychic powers. And so they didn't believe their own results. And this is a general problem within science, that it's just human nature that it's not a scientific problem, really. It's a human nature problem that people believe what they want to believe. And it's just as true in the academic world as it is anywhere else. And of course, it's a little bit tragic that in the face of actual empirical evidence, strong empirical evidence over long periods of time, people still don't believe it if they don't want to. Well, I think fortunately that's probably a minority of scientists. It's probably about 20% of scientists have very strong opinions about these sort of things, despite not actually knowing the literature. And even in cases like this rare case where there was a replication by skeptics, they still won't believe. And by the way, the reason why they don't believe it is not so much about the empirical data. It's more about not having a theory that would lead them to expect why such a thing would work. You see this again and again. If somebody doesn't have a way of explaining how it can be, then they won't believe it. So I'm jumping over a huge amount of additional data that I can talk about here, but I want to leave enough time so we can have a discussion. So the conclusion in all this is that was Buddha just a nice guy? In other words, did our special masters with ancient wisdom actually have that wisdom and had abilities that are talked about in our legends? I think the answer is yes. Some of it is amenable to scientific study, not all of it yet. Those aspects that have been amenable to scientific study, and we're talking about simple things like elementary psychic abilities, like telepathy, like precognition, clairvoyance, and some forms of mind-matter interaction, the evidence is very, very good at this point that those are real phenomena. And if you work with people who are talented, you get much better results in the laboratory. So that gives you a certain face validity that the stories about these cities are probably correct. That tells us in this case that Patanjali was not spinning a fairy tale when he was writing up the Yoga Sutras, and that Buddha was probably more than a nice guy. Actually, I think all of us are more than nice guys, but Buddha and a few others had a way of demonstrating that made it quite clear. So here we are in the laboratory, and this is part of the challenge of doing this sort of work. We are consciousness studying consciousness, essentially. All of the psychic phenomena are basically telling us something about the capacities of consciousness that are well understood within the esoteric traditions, but so far not within science. So I think I'm going to stop there. Much more I can say about any of this, but I think I'll let you drive how the discussion goes from this point.
Well, Dean, thank you so much. And I know you have all kinds of wonderful data that can show much more research. I'm just going to take a minute and speak to the audience, and then I have a question for you. So last year we had at the conference Edgar Mitchell, who was the sixth man to walk on the moon, and on his return from Earth as an astronaut, had an expansion of consciousness, a samadhi-like experience. And in his desire to scientifically understand what was going on, he started and was the founder of the Institute of Noetic Science, as many of you know. And some of you may know that a few months ago, Edgar made transition and went on another great journey of expansion of consciousness. So he is no longer with us in the physical. But now my question for Dean. Dean, I wondered if you and Edgar had set up any kind of a scientific experiment that when he made transition, you could have a way that he would contact you or any of the scientists there for another wonderful scientific experiment.
We did not set up something in advance. We have heard from several mediums who spontaneously heard from Edgar and had messages for us, but it's not part of a formal experiment.
Right. Have you sensed his presence? I mean, this is not scientific per se, but have you sensed his presence in any way?
I haven't, no, but I hardly ever sense anyone's presence. Except in my home occasionally, and my two dogs.
Okay.
And every so often my wife.
Well, do keep us posted. Cassandra Veaton, the president of IONS, as you know, was a guest at my home, and we were talking about this. She told me that, as far as she knew, there was no experiment set up. But she said that she rather suspected that she might have a sense of Edgar's presence, coming in the future, because certainly he cares so much about Ion. So let us know if there's any more impressions.
My guess is that as a lifelong explorer, that once Edgar had the opportunity to directly visit other galaxies,
he's gone. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to turn this over to Sheldon, who will take questions from the audience.
All right. I say 1, 2, and I'll keep looking for hands. Jose, yeah, come on up so Dean can see you. Yeah.
Okay. Here. Hi, I'm Jose Becerra. I am a retired medical epidemiologist from the Centers for Disease Control, and I'm very familiar with your scientific methodology. In fact, I have a colleague of mine that went to work with you, I think, some time ago, David Addis. Is still there with you?
No.
No? Okay. My remark and question is about the process of a paradigm shift in the scientific world as a way to explain why this resistance to accept empirical findings. In the same way that we have a theoretical physicist in physics, in addition to empirical physicists, I think there may be lacking here the theoretical part that may bridge the gap in models, in the same way that we had the geocentric and the heliocentric models 500 years ago. Mm-hmm. And the whole issue of the retrogression of the planets was negated by those thinking that the Earth was the center of the universe. Something similar is happening here. It's just that the soul hasn't taken its place as a center of our observations, and we still think in terms of the Newtonian old physics, and they can't put it together. And we need to have more and more evidence. It will eventually, I think, burst into a new paradigm in the same way that eventually the heliocentric model was validated by empirical data. That was just my comment.
Well, and well said. So I'm going to switch over to some slides that actually from a different talk that I gave, which is exactly about this very issue. How do we deal with a paradigm that would both be acceptable to scientists, and it has to be, when every time a paradigm shifts, you could end up with a new perspective, but it has to accommodate what was previously known. Yeah. And science in particular, we within each discipline, we already know quite a bit. There's, of course, an infinite amount left to learn, but we can't have a paradigm shift that denies what is already learned. So how do we do that? So that's what I did this talk about. Let's see here. I can make this, and I'm going to share that screen. Okay, so can you see this screen now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so this basically is the issue that we're dealing with. There is a lot of evidence, of both evidence from the kind of research that I do and even people's personal spiritual experiences that says, something is happening here. There are those, like in this case, the cardinals, who don't want to look through it because they don't know how to deal with it. So what do we do? We can look at this from the point of view of two theories. The first theory is the mainstream science, neuroscience perspective. This is basically you're nothing but a pack of neurons and you're a machine made of meat. That's the prevailing view. A little brochure here, this Neuroscience Core Concepts. This comes from the Society for Neuroscience. Their annual meetings attract 30,000 people. It's very mainstream. And if you look through that book and you're trying to ask the question of what do you think consciousness actually is, it's changed a little bit over the years, but pretty much it's still this notion of you're a pack of neurons and a machine made of meat. And this, of course, is based on reductive materialism. It's the fundamental assumptions within science. And science has carved up the universe into different disciplines. It's assumed to sit on physics. Above physics emerges chemistry, and then biology, psychology, and somewhere near the top of the pyramid is awareness, or consciousness, or mind, whatever word you want to use. Somewhere above that are notions about spirituality, and above that, maybe mysticism and so on. but it's way far away from the basis on which science sits. The other thing about this is that the model that we have within a scientific framework is that from physics, meaning matter and energy, space and time, everything that we know emerges. Reality emerges from that. So awareness, being at the top of the pyramid, awareness has to emerge from the physical world. That's why in the neurosciences we are machines made of meat. Causation is strictly upwards in this model. And there are some disciplines that are created between physics and chemistry. There are disciplines between chemistry and biology and so on. But still pretty hierarchical, because it takes a scientist 20 years to become an expert, and then the rest of their life to remain an expert in a very thin slice of the whole pie. The second theory is consciousness is fundamental, meaning more fundamental than the physical world. And this, of course, is the perennial philosophy, and the esoteric traditions talk about this. And so the term that a philosopher might use is, this is an idealistic view, or panpsychism, or neutral monism. And all you need to do is take the existing knowledge pyramid used in science and do this to it. Yeah. That's all that's happening, is that we're taking the notion that consciousness is more fundamental than the physical world, and the physical world, including physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, emerge from that space. So just like an electron permeates everything above it, in this case we have awareness permeating everything above the physical world. In addition, you're going to still have all of these slices of disciplines, so we don't have to throw away any of our textbooks. And rather than calling this awareness emerges into physics, I use a slightly different term. I like the term precipitates. And the metaphor here is that we look out into the sky and it looks clear, maybe it's cloudy, and then occasionally things come out of the sky, like water, like hail, like tornadoes. The substance itself gives rise to things that were previously invisible. In this case, the substance we're talking about is consciousness or awareness. From that, structure arises that we then call space-time, energy, and matter. And from that, all of the rest fits. So we don't need to change models in physics or what we know about biology or anything. You're simply adding a new fundamental that science would sit upon. And as the moment you do that, all of the psychic phenomena, all of the mystical experiences, what people talk about in terms of spiritual concepts, makes a lot of sense. And it doesn't do any violence to science at all. So that's why I would say this here. Nothing about the extraordinary capacities of consciousness makes any sense at all, including even the fact of consciousness, unless it is fundamental. But I think that this is the way that I'm thinking now of what is happening in terms of a paradigm change. And you're beginning to see this actually in many different academic disciplines, that scientists are saying, well, we really don't have any idea about how consciousness can arise from pure matter. So maybe it was there all along. And if it's there all along, maybe it really is a new fundamental that everything should sit upon, in which case now both science, spirituality, and all the rest can begin to pull together in a way that makes actually rational sense. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but
thank you. That's a great answer. Great response. No, thank you. We have time for... Oh, gosh.
So it's going to be real quick. This is going to be real quick.
He's got a louder voice right now, Michael. So, yeah. Come ahead. This is one more, and then maybe telepathic questions after.
Fascinating presentation. I studied at the Institute for Parapsychology in Durham, successor to J.B. Rhine Laboratory, and was really exploring these ideas. Currently, are you familiar with Dr. Daniel Amen and his brain mapping, showing that PTSD, depression, things show a different picture of the brain? Could that be combined with this kind of Gansfeld research? Maybe neuroscientists could see that perhaps something's happening that they could correlate, not causative, but correlation. That's my question.
Sure. Yeah, there have been many studies looking at what we call EEG correlations between isolated people. Because if there's some kind of a telepathic rapport between people, the brain probably will show a correlation. So the studies there don't use images, they use much more simpler stimuli, like a light flash. So you have two people who are isolated, you flash a light in front of one person's eye, and then you see if the other person's brain responds. And the short answer is yes, it does, including doing the same experiment within a functional MRI, where you can see that when the sender is seeing a light flash in their eye, it's the portion of the brain lighting up in the receiver is the visual cortex and the occipital lobe in the back of your head, but that's the place that lights up. And that actually fits in well with what yogis are talking about, where you become the other person. The other person's brain is mimicking what is happening in the sender's brain. So it's you and the other person are not quite as separate as you think you are. And of course, that's a whole other talk I give on the illusion of separation. And that's one of the things that you begin to see here. Not only this is true from a quantum mechanical perspective, but of course from virtually all of the psychic abilities, the reason they seem strange is because they keep telling us that separation is an illusion.
Thank you, Dean. Yes. All right. Well, listen, this is wonderful. Thank you.